Welcome to your Chapter 6 video lecture series where we're going to cover Section 6.2 on integumentary structures derived from the epidermis. Here are your learning objectives. We have quite a few again. And we'll start off discussing your nails. So the structure of your nail, we're going to see that there's a scale-like modification of your stratum corneum, that top layer of your epidermis, or most superficial layer of your epidermis. We'll see that they are on the dorsal edges of your fingers and toes, dorsal meaning the back of your fingers. And remember, we're going to always go back to anatomical position. So when you're in anatomical position, remember that your palms are facing anteriorly or forward and the back of your hand is facing posteriorly. So that's why we're saying this is the dorsal edge of your finger, and also the top of your feet are known as the dorsum of your foot, whereas the part of your foot that is touching the floor when you're walking or standing, that's known as the plantar surface of your foot. And then the reason we have our nails is really to protect the distal tips of your digits. They can also help assist with grasping objects. And on this distal edge, we're going to see this whitish free edge. There are no underlying capillaries here, and that's why it has that white pigmentation. The pinkish nail body over here has capillaries underlying it, and that's why you see a little bit of pink pigmentation there. Our nail root that you see over here is going to partly be embedded into our skin. So this portion over here is our skin. And this nail root, along with the nail body that we discussed and the free edge, are all constituting the nail plate. And the nail bed, which we see below over here in this pink, is going to be the layer of our living epidermis covered by our nail body. Now let's talk about our nail matrix. So careful, because a lot of people mix up this nail root with the nail matrix. The nail matrix has actively growing portions of our nail at the proximal end. So if this nail matrix becomes damaged, then the nail will no longer grow. Now you may have noticed when you were looking at your nail that you have this half moon shaped structure over here. This is called the lunula and is going to always be found on the proximal end of our nail body. And our nail folds are areas where we're going to have folding of our skin overlapping our nails. We do have our cuticle here, which now we have a fancy word to know for this, and that is the epinecium. And we'll see that it too is going to be made up of epidermis and forms that margin of the nail onto the nail body. And if you look at this end of the nail where we have our free edge, right underneath there, the portion where the skin is making contact with the nail, that is called your hyponychium. Here we'll see some thickened stratum corneum in which the free edge of the nail is going to project over it. Now for a clinical view on nails and some nail disorders. You can tell a lot from somebody's health just by looking at their nails. So if someone has brittle nails that are prone to breaking, especially a vertical splitting and separation of their nail plate, it could mean that they're just too dry and have little moisture, and they're most commonly caused by if you do like repeated washing and drying of your fingernails, especially if you are being overexposed to detergents, household cleaners, and nail polish remover, especially if you use straight acetone. And then next we have ingrown nails, and you can see a picture of this over here with the edge of the nail digging into the skin. Sometimes people suffer from onychomycosis, and this is a fungal infection of the nail. There is yellow nail syndrome when the growth and thickening starts to slow. This could mean that this person has improper circulation, or drainage of the lymph allows fluid to collect under soft tissue under the nail, which is giving that yellow pigmentation. And sometimes it could develop on its own too for certain types of cancers or autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis or immunodeficiencies. If someone has a spoon nail like this, it means that the outer surface of the nail is concave. If this has taken place, it could be a sign that there is an iron deficiency type of anemia or a liver condition known as hemochromatosis, in which your body absorbs too much iron from the food that you're eating. And then we have Bowes lines, which are going to indicate a temporary interference with nail growth. And vertical ridging here is common and usually harmless, but it could mean that maybe you have some type of vitamin deficiency. Now let's move into hair. Hair is found almost everywhere on the body. We've got keratinized cells that form a slender filament, and it's going to grow from hair follicles. We have 3 classifications of hair types. First is lanugo, in which is very fine, unpigmented, downy hair that's going to appear on the baby in the last trimester. Then we have villus, or fine hair, and this is the best example I could find of this. It's kind of like peach fuzz, and it's the primary human hair found on the upper limbs and the lower limbs, and especially in males, we will find that this is kind of indicative when we have someone in early adolescence, but then once they go through puberty, it turns into terminal hair, which is going to be a coarser, more pigmented and longer type of hair. We'll find this hair on the scalp, our eyebrows, eyelashes, and men's beards. During puberty, that villus hair that we described in the axillary and the pubic regions get turned into the terminal hair. So we have 3 zones along our hair length. We have the hair bulb, which is this region down here. Notice that this is taking place in the dermis, and it's kind of swollen and round. It's also going to surround the hair papilla, which you can see better in this histology slide, I believe, and it's composed of connective tissue, and it's the only region that's going to contain living epithelial cells. And then we have our hair root, which starts above the area of the bulb and extends up to the very last surface of the stratum corneum. And the hair shaft is going to be the region that starts at the region of the superficial surface of the skin and continues to grow beyond that. We have some other hair components to make note of. Our matrix, in which we're going to see that this is the base of the hair bulb. Our epithelial cells are going to divide here, which help produce new cells to gradually be pushed toward the surface. And then we have 3 layers. This is a little bit small in here, but this is figure 6.10 if you want to take a closer look in your text. In the center, we are going to have your medulla. This is remnant of our matrix as it moves up. It's going to be flexible, and we have soft keratin in here. Outside of that, we have the cortex, which is flattened cells that are closer to the outer hair surface, and it's relatively hard. And then we have the cuticle on the outside here, and this is just a single cell layer that surrounds the cortex. You may have seen in hair commercials when they zoom in on hair, these cuticles sometimes look like roof shingles sitting on top of one another. And for our hair follicle. So your hair follicle is going to be these layers that are found outside of the medulla, cortex, and cuticles. So these pink and purple layers over here make up the hair follicle. It's an oblique tube that's going to surround the hair root and extends into the dermis and sometimes even into the subcutaneous layer. The outer connective tissue root sheath is going to originate in the dermis, so that's this outer portion in here. And then our inner epithelial tissue root sheath is going to originate from the epidermis. Also connected to our hair follicle is this erector pili muscle. These are thin ribbons of smooth muscle that are extending from the hair follicle to a dermal papilla. And this is an important muscle for keeping us warm. When we get cold, our muscle will contract, causing this hair to stand erect, giving us goosebumps. And it's meant to keep this hair up so we can trap some air underneath it and keep that air on the surface of our skin a little bit warmer. So you could see that taking place over here as we discuss the functions of hair. First of all, it's going to help protect us. It keeps dust particles and pathogens out of certain areas. In our eyebrow region, it's going to even stop perspiration or sweat from dripping into our eye. And then it helps to give us some facial expressions. Again, use of the eyebrow here in conveying a certain emotion. And then we have heat retention, where we have our goosebumps to trap that air and keep it closer to our skin to warm it up, keeping us warmer. Our sensory reception, when we touch the surface of the skin, is it deep pressure? Is it painful stimuli that's coming in? Is it a vibration type of stimuli? And visual identification too. It's going to help to give us a certain look, right? And chemical signal dispersal. What we mean by this is by use of pheromones. You may have heard of pheromones before, but we have glands in the areas such as armpits, genital regions, and even navels that are going to secrete a clear liquid that contains pheromones. And our pheromone scent is going to reach the noses of the opposite sex in this structure called the vomeronasal organ. It works into our olfactory system, which helps us with the sense of smell, right? And will bypass our rational brain. This information is then fed directly to the behavior center within our brain. And if this information is communicated by our pheromone scent that is positive, then you are likely to respond in attraction for this person. Now for hair color, we're going to have a synthesis of melanin in the matrix adjacent to that hair papillae. It is going to lighten with age as that pigment production decreases, and our gray hairs are going to result from a gradual reduction in that melanin. White hair occurs due to complete stoppage of melanin production, and usually when one hair starts to go gray or white, the surrounding hairs in that area will also do the same thing. And that is due to some of the cellular components that have to do with aging of that hair. And then we have hair growth. So there are 3 phases of hair growth cycle. We have the anagen, which is the active phase, and that is going to take place within 2 to 6 years. We have the catagen phase, which is a brief regression in this phase path, where it's going to stop growing for maybe 1 to 2 weeks. Then we have the telogen phase, which is a resting phase, and that's about 5 to 6 weeks. And then you'll see that we'll repeat the cycle all over again, and we will return to the anagen phase, where that hair matrix will start to form a new hair if that hair breaks off. Now let's discuss hair loss just a little bit. It is normal to lose about 10 to 100 hairs per day. When we have an excessive amount of that, then we can have thinning of the hair known as alopecia, and this could be due to aging. We can have diffuse hair loss, which is pictured over here, where the hair is going to shed from all parts of the scalp. This happens primarily in women, and it's due to hormones or drugs or an iron deficiency. You may have also heard of male pattern baldness. This is when we have a loss of hair first from only the crown region of the scalp, and then it may continue to look something like this alopecia. This is genetic, and there are hormonal factors that are taken into account if a person suffers from this. Then we have hirsutism. This is excessive male pattern hairiness. Now let's move into our exocrine glands of the skin. This is going to include our sweat glands and sebaceous glands, but we're going to start off with our sweat glands. We do have two different types. First type is called our eccrine or merocrine sweat glands. You could see that this one is going to open up to the surface of our skin at a sweat pore, whereas our apocrine gland, which is also a sweat gland, is going to secrete that onto the hair root, which will then be carried up. So first, let's discuss some detail on that merocrine or eccrine sweat gland. Remember, that's this one that's coiled up and then has a duct that brings it up to the surface of the epidermis. This is going to be the most numerous type of sweat gland and the most widely distributed. We are going to have simple coiled tubular glands here, and it's going to discharge those secretions onto the surface of our skin, like I mentioned earlier. It takes place by secretion of exocytosis. So we are going to have vesicles that contain the sweat and then we'll release it. And our sweat is composed 99% of water and 1% of other chemicals. This would include electrolytes, metabolites, and waste products, and plays a major role in thermoregulation. That is because as the sweat is released onto the surface of our skin, we are going to have that evaporate off, which cools our body down. And here is a nice illustration that shows you that exocytosis that takes place. Here is a cell within our sweat gland, and you could see that it is producing these vesicles that contain the sweat within it, and then that vesicle buds up to the very end of the cell and releases the sweat. Now let's discuss our apocrine sweat glands. These are also going to be coiled tubular glands, but they're going to discharge their secretions into the hair follicle in specific areas such as the axillae, the armpits, around the nipples, and in the pubic and anal regions. They produce secretion by exocytosis as well, but it's a little bit different. And you could see this down here where a portion of the cell is pinching off. So here's that pinched off portion that contains the sweat within it. The sweat is also going to be a viscous type of cloudy secretion, and it's going to contain proteins and lipids, and it produces odor when it's acted on by bacteria. And you can imagine that these secretions start around puberty, and that's when adolescents are starting to get that body odor to them because of this. Now let's discuss the sebaceous glands or the oil glands. These are now known as halocrine glands, and they produce an oily secretion known as sebum. So you could see its relationship over here with the hair. This does secrete the oil onto the hair to serve as a lubricant, and as it carries it up onto the epidermis, it lubricates the skin as well. This is really helpful for our immune system because the sebum is also bactericidal and forms something known as an acidic mantle, an acidity onto our skin in which some microorganisms cannot handle. The secretion is stimulated by hormones, especially androgens, and is going to be activated during puberty. So here you could see one of these sebaceous cells. It is producing its sebum, and it is going to basically break itself off, committing suicide and allowing those secretory products to be released so that this actual cell will die. Now for some of those other integumentary glands I said I was going to mention. First we have ceruminous glands. You could see them pictured over here. And actually this just reminded me of one thing. So we're going to go back just a couple slides here. There we go. I forgot to talk about this histology slide over here. I placed this to show you in a histology plate how we can differentiate an Eastern sweat gland versus an apocrine sweat gland. Our Eastern sweat glands are going to be much smaller. You could see that their lumens are very narrowed, whereas when we look at our apocrine sweat glands, they have these really large lumens. By lumen, I mean like the space inside the duct. So you can see that it is very large, these white portions. Also, if we're lucky enough, we might see this apocrine sweat gland next to a hair follicle because we know that it's going to secrete its sweat onto the hair follicle, whereas with our Eastern sweat glands, we should not really see a hair follicle associated with it. Now, back to our ceruminous glands. These are going to be modified apocrine sweat glands, so you can see that they still have those large lumens within them, but we're only going to find these glands in the external ear canal, and their job is to produce cerumen or ear wax, which is waterproof. It helps to trap foreign material, and it lubricates the acoustic meatus in the eardrum, and some theorize that our body was made to produce cerumen in order to keep insects out of our ears too. And then we have our mammary glands over here. These are modified apocrine sweat glands as well, except they belong to the breast, and they only function in pregnant and lactating females, and their job is to produce breast milk. And here is a clinical view on acne and acne treatments. The way acne can take place is if we have plugged sebaceous ducts. It typically is going to begin around puberty, and we start to see an increase in the activity of these sebaceous glands that may cause that blockage of the pores. And treatment could be with benzoyl peroxide or salicylic acid, antibiotics, vitamin A-like compounds, and systemic retinoids. If it is left untreated, it may also lead to scarring.